All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are talking about how the addition of wide receiver Cameron Batson actually signals the Falcons may be looking to address their trenches later this summer, as well as talk a little bit more about this team's rebuild and their timeline there to see what's at stake this upcoming season and whether or not that's going to help us gauge when this team will be back in playoff contention in the future.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter, at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast here as part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. Today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline is where the game starts. So today we'll sort of be rehashing a little bit of what Arthur Smith had to say at this most recent OTAs and how he's sort of signaling that the Falcons may be looking to upgrade the trenches. But we'll also talk about the addition of Cam Batson and how he sort of affects the potential roster battles at that wide receiver position. And then later in the episode, we'll be jumping into the conversation about this team's timeline with the rebuild and where I am in terms of that timeline and maybe where you guys are and sort of that differing perspective on that, which leads to a lot of frustration from some of you guys with my assessment of the team, as well as my frustration with some of your guys' assessment of the team. So we'll get into all of that on today's episode, but let's sort of update you on last week's roster news. The Falcons signing Cam Batson on Wednesday, June 1st, and needing to cut somebody on Thursday, June 2nd, which led a lot of people hoping, speculating maybe that some big name would be released. But of course, if you've been listening to Locked On Falcons podcast these last couple of weeks, you kind of knew that no big splashes were likely to happen on June 2nd in regards to a certain Falcons veteran linebacker. And instead, the Falcons just wound up cutting Rashad Coward, former Bears offensive lineman, was expected to contribute to the Falcons defensive line after starting out his career as a defensive lineman before moving to the offensive line a couple of years ago. And that only adds fuel to the fire that I've been, stoking these last couple of weeks, that I think, a defensive line addition is potentially imminent with the Falcons moving on from Rashad Coward. And Arthur Smith also fueled that fire with some of his comments this past weekend at OTAs, but we'll sort of circle back to that. Let's talk a little bit more about Cam Batson and what he's bringing to the table. And it's similar to the addition of Geronimo Allison. At this point in time, I think you can kind of consider Batson to be more of a camp body. He's an undersized guy, spent 4 years with the Titans playing under Arthur Smith, brings some speed and some quickness to the lineup. And that's something that the Falcons have been sorely lacking at the wide receiver group as they've, been so, focused on adding more size. But while I call Batson more of a camp body, it's not because him or Geronimo Allison and some of these other guys aren't capable of contributing to an NFL roster. Again, Batson has been a semi-productive reserve player, was the primary replacement for Adam Humphries 2 years ago in 2020 when he went out with the injury in the slot for that team. But the main reason I label these guys camp bodies is because they lack special teams value. And you're looking at some of these guys like Allison and Batson. No, we're not talking about return abilities because Batson does have some experience there, but we know that returning kicks and punts is not really a way, a great avenue for some of these wide receivers and other players to make the roster, because the Falcons have Cordero Patterson, arguably the greatest kickoff returner of all time, and Avery Williams was very good in that return role last year. When we're talking about special teams contributions, we're talking about coverage, and we're mainly talking about punt coverage because kickoffs in today's NFL are mostly marginalized, which is part of the reason why kickoff return skills as good as Patterson and Williams were in that regard is not necessarily really moving the needle in that regard. And when you look at this wide receiver depth chart, guys like Cam Batson, Geronimo Allison, and Auden Tate don't have a lot of proven roles on punt coverage. They have those three guys combined have 12 snaps in punt coverage across 12 combined seasons, and all 12 of those were from Geronimo Allison. And all those guys enter camp potentially on the roster bubble for that very reason. And essentially the way it works is that last year, and I think that's not going to change this year, is the Falcons will carry about 5 wide receivers on their 48-man active roster each and every game day. They may carry extra guys on their 53-man roster, but those guys will be mostly inactive on Sundays. And primarily 3 of those 5 receivers are going to play on offense, largely due to the fact that Arthur Smith hates 11 personnel or 3 wide receiver sets. The Falcons were 31st in the NFL last year in usage of 11 personnel. They were dead last in the NFL in terms of usage of any personnel grouping that included 3 or more wide receivers. And so you only really need 3 receivers in this offense to be effective offensively. And it's very likely those guys are going to be Drake London, Brian Edwards, and Damiere Byrd in some combination. The 4th guy that is basically a reserve in the event of a game day injury, but also could contribute on special teams, is tailor-made for Olamide Zaccheaus. He was primarily, like Cordero Patterson, the team's primary punt gunner to start last season. And then because of injuries to Russell Gage and the departure of Calvin Ridley, Zaccheaus got a promotion just like Patterson, because he became the team's primary weapon and at the running back position over Mike Davis about a month into the season, also got a promotion and no longer was the punt gunner. And that allowed guys like Frank Darby to sort of enter the fray. But that 4th wide receiver in Olamide Zaccheaus is perfect to be a gunner and contribute on offense when the top 3 receivers need a breather. And then that 5th wide receiver that's active on game day is exclusively a special teams guy. And last year that was Frank Darby. This year it's really a battle between him and Kadero Hodge, who was especially productive as a gunner for the Cleveland Browns a couple of years ago. And that's why I think Hodge is a better bet to make this roster than a lot of people perceive, even arguably a better bet than Auden Tate is, which is, controversial, at least based off of some tweets I sent out 3 weeks ago on Falcons Twitter. But I think for a guy like Cameron Batson, it's an uphill battle to climb. He's really going to need some injury help from other guys getting hurt, I think, to potentially make this roster. And it's going to be tough for him. And Arthur Smith kind of indicated this over the weekend in his presser, prior to the open OTAs that the Falcons ran at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. In my brain, I almost said Georgia Dome. But at MBS, he basically said that this time of year is kind of an extended tryout for some of these wide receivers, which is why you've seen the Falcons add so many skill position players over the last 3 or so weeks. They added a running back in Jeremy McNichols. They added 3 veteran receivers in Brian Edwards, Cameron Batson, and Geronimo Allison. And essentially, Arthur Smith said it's kind of like an extended 7-on-7 period because it's no contact. And he indicated that the team may be looking to address the trenches later this summer, probably closer to training camp, was heavily implied, due to the fact that once we get to training camp, there will be some contact, and that's where the offensive lineman and defensive lineman can be better evaluated. But during this phase, there's little to no contact, so they're not really doing anything other than just doing back drills or whatever the case may be. And so that suggests, as you've heard me say on the podcast several times over the last couple of weeks, that more roster moves are imminent along the trenches. We've talked quite a bit about adding some help on the offensive line, adding some proven help on the defensive line, etc. And so Arthur Smith's sort of putting out there that we may see that. So clearly Arthur Smith is confirming this great content that we put out here on Locked On Falcons as we go. So we'll keep an eye on that. So for those of you that are a little, impatient or panicking about, where's the trench help coming, be patient. If we get 2 months from now in early August and the Falcons still haven't added that trench help, that's the time to panic. But right now, for now, it's going to be all fine. So we'll keep you guys clued in on that. But speaking of patience, we'll spend the rest of today's podcast devoted to how patient we should be when it comes to the timeline of the Falcons and their rebuild and just how far along they are in that regard. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, especially the ATL Day Ones podcast, one of the 3 shows that you can find daily on that podcast feed on your preferred podcast app or on YouTube. ATL Day Ones, hosted by Jarvis Davis, Tenitra Batiste. Both Jarvis and Tenitra were on hand at the open OTAs over the weekend. So if you want to get the latest scoops on what exactly is going on during this, extended 7-on-7 phase of the offseason, they got you covered. Mark Zeno with A to Z as well as John Chuckery, the host of Hitting Hard, will also have you covered like Jarvis and Tanisha do on all of Atlanta, all of Georgia sports, as well as national sports, all on the same podcast feed. So go subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta. And if you want to also get your Atlanta Braves postcast, Locked On Braves is breaking down each win, each loss for the Atlanta Braves as well on the Locked On Sports Atlanta YouTube channel. And guys, earlier this spring, we told you all about Blue Nile leading up to Mother's Day. And that's not the only time of year where you want to celebrate your loved one with a classic, timeless piece of jewelry. Whether you're looking to pop that question, Blue Nile has these simple online tools that let you choose your diamond shape, your size, clarity, as well as setting style to handcraft that perfect one-of-a-kind engagement ring for your special someone. Or maybe you're looking for something a little less permanent, right? Maybe you're having trouble choosing what that less permanent thing is. And Blue Nile has the jewelry experts available 24/7 via phone, via chat to find that memorable gift that fits every single person's budget. So make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com. And our listeners get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. This podcast exclusive includes engagement rings. Just use the code Locked On. That's code Locked On. Plus, every order is insured, ships free, and arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. So shop stress-free and find your forever piece by going to BlueNile.com today. And guys, I also want to tell you that today's episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why wait while the person behind the counter orders parts on their computer when you can order parts on your computer at home or in your pocket that already has access to rockauto.com. Save time and money when using Rock Auto instead of spending up to twice as much for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership. Rock Auto is a family business. It serves do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years, and they have reliably low prices for every single customer. And they have everything you need from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Just go to rockauto.com right now, browse their easy-to-use website, and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so that they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So, this conversation about the Falcons rebuild is stemming somewhat from previous conversations we had on Locked On Falcons, as well as a recent episode of the Athletic Football Show where Robert Mays, Nate Tice, and Mike Sando were talking about some of the more recent successful rebuilds that other teams have perpetuated or executed, I guess you could say. And my big takeaway listening to that episode, where I think is highly recommended you guys go check that out, but not a whole lot applied to the Falcons. And the examples that they used were the Chiefs under Andy Reid, the 49ers under Kyle Shanahan, the Rams under Sean McVay, the Bills under Sean McDermott. Maybe there was another one that I'm forgetting. But it seemed like the commonality between a lot of those teams and their success was that they got the quarterback and they got the coach right. And obviously the 49ers are still somewhat in flux with the quarterback conversation. But it also indicates how meaningful the presence of someone like Jimmy G has been for that team the last couple of years. And we know Shanahan overall has been a sub 500 coach in San Francisco. But when you look at the games where Jimmy G has been their starter, it's literally the difference between being a 4-win team and being a 12-win team based off of their win percentage. And that's just a great example of how important quarterback play can be for any number of teams. And so that's why it's important that the Falcons, ultimately get that right. Because it's very hard to be successful in this league if you don't have a quarterback. But I think it's led to me still having questions about the current situation for the Falcons, not only at quarterback, but also at the coaching position. You look at those previous examples like Andy Reid, getting the coach right. Like Andy Reid elevated the Chiefs long before they got, Patrick Mahomes. You look at Sean McVay elevating in making us believe that Jared Goff was actually a halfway decent quarterback. No offense to Jared Goff, who's perfectly fine, but like not a high level quarterback. And we know that Sean McDermott's Bills teams and those defenses actually were what kind of carried those teams to the postseason long before Josh Allen became one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. And so my big question is whether or not we're going to get that same sort of contribution from Arthur Smith, elevating particularly the offensive side of the ball. And based off of that 2021 season, the answer is kind of no. And, I'm sure I'll get plenty of feedback telling me how it was impossible for Arthur Smith to have success last year and elevate last year's offense due to the lack of talent. I generally disagree with that, but we're not going to necessarily get into that debate on today's episode. But when we're talking about players making year 1 to year 2 jumps, I think the person that has to make the biggest year 1 to year 2 jump, in my humble opinion, this year for the Falcons is Arthur Smith. And to be frank, if he doesn't make that big leap forward from a play calling standpoint, from a game managing standpoint, all those various other factors that we judge head coaches on, this team is doomed. Not doomed in the sense that they're, destined to go 2-15 every year, but doomed in the sense of them being mediocre every single year. And then basically the conclusion is, instead of hiring Andy Reid, that's going to successfully perpetuate or successful rebuild for the Falcons may have just wound up hiring Matt Nagy as a Reid disciple who wasn't able to bring that same level of success to Chicago and is now out of a job. And you can call that negativity. I consider it just to be scrutinizing and as we should be doing. And certainly, it's fair when we talk about the quote unquote negativity on this podcast. It's fair to say that if the glass is half full, we spend too much time complaining about how, or at least when I say the royal we, I spend too much time on this podcast complaining about how it's half empty rather than it's half full. But, I feel like for me personally, I understand probably better than a lot of Falcon fans that the NFL stands for not for long. And there's a ticking clock on this regime. Even though that ticking isn't particularly loud right now, there's a point in the future, probably sooner than you realize, that ticking is going to get a lot louder. And the margin for error that it takes to take a team that Arthur Smith inherited that misses the playoffs 3 years in a row to being a team that goes from missing the playoffs from 3 years in a row to 7 years in a row to 10 years to 15 years in a row is very, very thin. And a lot of that is tied to the quarterback. And I think part of the reason why I am not as, gung-ho and optimistic about this team's future is, and I'm constantly expressing this on the podcast, is I know the odds in terms of currently sitting here right now for the Falcons at the quarterback position aren't really in their favor to overcome those odds. And we already know that the hit rate on quarterbacks is already low. Even if we were taking guys at the top of last year's draft with a top, 4 pick selection, we knew that the odds were telling us that out of those 5 quarterbacks at the top of last year's class, it's very likely that 3 of them would wind up busting out in the NFL. And the odds didn't get better with the Falcons being able to draft Desmond Ridder this year. And that's nothing to do with Desmond Ridder not having the ability to be a high-level quarterback. It's just when you start looking at it and you start looking at these quarterbacks taken in rounds 2, 3, and 4, where we got Desmond Ridder in round 3, depending on what parameters you're using in terms of the hit rate, you're looking at a number as low as 10%. You're looking at a number at best as 20%. And when you look at the guys that are able to overcome those odds and succeed early enough in their careers to be on a timeline that is, important for someone like Arthur Smith, you find basically that list shrinks even more. And you're basically looking at guys like Russell Wilson, Dak Prescott, and Colin Kaepernick. And as we've discussed repeatedly on the podcast, there's seems some through lines, some commonalities between those guys. Those guys joined teams that were already playoff teams that kind of check the boxes of running game, offensive line, and defense. Now, we know Russell Wilson didn't have a great offensive line in Seattle, but he had Marshawn Lynch, 1,500-yard rusher as a rookie, and one of the top running backs of the last decade on his team, and one of the best defenses of the last decades, that he inherited. Colin Kaepernick checked all 3 boxes. Frank Gore is a running game, one of the best, arguably the best offensive line in the league at that time, and one of the best defenses in the league that was only second to those Seahawk defenses. And Dak Prescott, of course, also had arguably the best offensive line in football, had a great running game helmed by Zeke Elliott, and at least a decent defense in Dallas. So when we look at those situations and those commonalities as they apply to the Atlanta Falcons, again, I don't bring these up to be negative. I just say, this is the type of scrutiny that this regime deserves, and they also kind of set for themselves, because we go back to last year, their first year on the job, their first 13 months on the job, all this team and regime talked about was that we're going to build up the roster first and then go get our quarterback. They were saying this as recent as this past year's combine. Then things seemingly changed a couple of weeks later. But I feel like we have to have this conversation Not to be negative, but are the Falcons checking some of these same boxes that we've seen so many quarterbacks or so many teams check in order to successfully rebuild these teams and or sort of ease the transition for some of these quarterbacks into the league? And when I look at these three boxes, the running game, the offensive line, and defense, I feel like right now I'm more optimistic about the defense. I don't expect this unit to be top 15 or anything like that, but they were 30th in DVOA last year. I feel like it's reasonable and expected that they can maybe get into the 20 to 25 range this year and be at a level comparable to many of the defenses that we've had in the Matt Ryan era, which when we had an elite offense, like it felt like it was holding us back. But like, again, this is a starting point. We're rebuilding. So we're trying to get back to a level of decency. And I certainly would feel a lot more optimistic about them reaching, that sort of level of decency if they were to add another difference maker, another quality player up front on that defensive line. But the other areas, the offensive line, the running game, are certainly areas of concern. And we'll have to wait and see if they can upgrade those spots between now and the start of the season. But, regardless of who's the quarterback, whether it's Desmond Ridder, whether it's Justin Fields, whether it's CJ Stroud, it's hard to be overly optimistic that any quarterback that the Falcons could have here is really set up for success because the Falcons aren't checking as many of those boxes. But, we'll kind of move off of that conversation and talk a little bit more about some of the expectations heading into this season. Recently, I put out a poll on Twitter asking people, how many wins they expect the Falcons to win this year. And over 1,500 people voted. And about 75% of the people responded with a win total somewhere between 4 and 7 wins. And I feel like that's very reasonable. I tend to be on the lower end of that range of 4 to 5 wins. I think other people are more on the upper end, 6 or 7 wins. I think we all kind of expect this team to be scrappy, a lot more competitive than they were a year ago, despite, those differences in expectations in terms of win total. And I think that's going to allow this team to build off of that into the future. And, I think the more optimistic fans feel like they can build off of that to the point where they can be a legit playoff team as early as 2023. I tend to be a little bit more negative or less optimistic, let's say, and feel like their timeline is more like, I think they can make strides in 2023, but I really feel like their sweet spot maybe potentially for a playoff berth is probably 2024. But we'll sort of have to see how that goes. And obviously how that timeline plays out is heavily dependent on how much growth and how much development we see from this team and this roster and this coaching staff this upcoming season. And that gets us to the last topic of the day, sort of how many pieces do the Falcons already have established in terms of their timeline for this rebuild? And one of the things I tweeted out, last month was, I think the more optimistic fans feel like it's like 70% done in terms of the rebuild. And sort of the foundation has been laid in that regard. I feel like it's probably half that number, closer to 30%. And we'll talk about exactly why I feel that way as we continue today's episode, talking about sort of the remaining questions that need to be answered this upcoming season. But before we get there, guys, I do want to ask you a favor by heading on over to lockedonpodcasts.com/survey to help us out and make this show as well as other Locked On shows even better by taking that surveys. Tell us what you like, what you don't like about Locked On shows. And it's not going to take too much time. And everybody that completes a survey will qualify for a chance to win one of 10 $100 Ticketmaster gift cards. Again, that's lockedonpodcast.com/survey. Thank you in advance. And guys, there's no better time to head on over to betonline.net, the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info, from the latest odds, contests, player props, you name it. BetOnline has it all. This time of year is great to head on over to BetOnline. This weekend, you got the Belmont Stakes, you got UFC 275. Later on, you got the US Open in golf, you got Wimbledon later this summer, the Stanley Cup Finals, NBA Finals are going on right now, Major League Baseball, of course. You also got boxing, esports, Vegas casino games, whatever you want. If you want to lay down some prop bets for the NFL season, Falcon stuff, is Drake London Offensive Rookie of the Year, Arthur Smith Coach of the Year, Marcus Mariota, that Island boy, is going to win Comeback Player of the Year, you name it, by taking advantage by heading on over to the website today at betonline.net. Learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline is where the game starts. So when we're talking about assessing this Falcons roster, sort of the parameters of what we're talking about is kind of how many guys currently on offense and defense do we feel like are going to be core or key contributors on that eventual playoff team that we're hoping the Falcons are going to be? And obviously, all of this is subjective. And we're not going to get too deep on sort of what I think a core contributor is versus what you think a core contributor is. But I feel like this roster right now is consisting of a whole lot of maybes. And I think probably one of the key points of divergence why we have maybe differing perspectives. Maybe you're a little bit more positive. Maybe I'm a little bit too negative. Maybe you're lower on this team than I am. I'm sure the three of you out there that are listening, there's three of you. Some of the reasons why you guys think I'm a hater is that you guys feel like some of these maybes you feel a little bit better about some of these maybes than I do. But when we look at the offense and defense and look at the 22 players, I think I kind of group them into tiers. The tier one are the guys that are like over 90% certainty that they're going to be foundational cornerstone pieces of that eventual playoff team. And the guys I put in that tier are like Chris Lindstrom, AJ Terrell, and Kyle Pitts. You can't have 100% certainty in this league because injuries happen and other factors happen, particularly with Kyle Pitts, because my confidence in him sort of hitting that ceiling that he has, that we all know he possesses, and the potential that we all know he possesses is, how much confidence you have in Arthur Smith, right? In his play calling, which for me personally is not particularly high at this point in time. Then you go to tier two. These are the guys that, we kind of know are cornerstone pieces, but they're a little long in the tooth, right? That's the Grady Jarrett, that's the Jake Matthews tier. And both of those guys signed extensions, so you feel good about them, still being around if and when this Falcon team is a playoff team. But the reality of those extensions is they're kind of 1-year contracts that the Falcons can get out of both of those deals as early as 2024. And so after the 2023 season, we're basically on a year-to-year basis. And one of the things that you can legitimately give this regime a lot of credit for is that they have been, very limited, frugal as it may, and I don't mean that in a negative connotation, when it comes to their expenditures, right? They signed a whole bunch of guys to 1-year deals this past offseason. Even the guys that got multi-year deals are really just 1-year deals. And even their two big money deals in terms of Grady Jarrett and Jake Matthews are really just 1-year extensions. And so this team is essentially saying, we're not going to put this team into cap hell anytime soon like the previous regime. And that's certainly a smart move because there's no reason to think that this team is on the verge of winning a Super Bowl like the previous regime thought those teams were when they started throwing, all that money around to try to keep the band together in order to achieve that dream. And, part of me is kind of curious how that applies to next offseason when the Falcons are much more flush with cash and whether or not they're going to be as frugal as, with the guaranteed money and whatnot, how that influences, extensions for guys like Chris Lindstrom and AJ Terrell, which you assume the team will potentially start negotiating at some point in the next 12 months, and as well as sort of trying to attract big money free agents next offseason. So obviously we don't know the answers to that. I'm not trying to sort of say, oh, this is a problem or anything like that, but we'll just sort of have to cross that bridge when we get to it. But moving on to sort of the tier 3 guys, these are the sort of young guys that I feel reasonably confident, reasonably optimistic will be good in the future. Just we'll see, you never know. And the reason why you can't be super confident at this point, because they're rookies, right? And we know, draft hit rate isn't great. Like, only about 25% of players drafted turn into quality starters, and only less than 10% of them turn into like perennial Pro Bowlers. But that's basically Drake London and Arnold Ebiketie, the two more talented of this draft class. And that's where that 30% figure comes from me, because I basically just named 7 guys in those top 3 tiers. And that's exactly, 32% of the 22 potential contributors on offense and defense. And then you have a whole bunch of maybes, right? You got some proven vets like Casey Hayward and Cordero Patterson, but both of those guys are a little long in the tooth as well. They're both kind of operating on a 1-year contracts. If and when this team is a playoff team, even if you're optimistic and think that's going to be next year, Casey Hayward's going to be 34 when next year kicks off. Cordero Patterson's going to be 32. And so we'll have to sort of see about that. You also have some more proven veteran starters like Marcus Mariota and Rashaan Evans and Lorenzo Carter, but they're on their 1-year contract, so they're not necessarily guaranteed to be around in this sort of playoff timeline that we're talking about. And then you're looking at a bunch of guys like, Desmond Ridder, Tyler Algier, Brian Edwards, many of the young offensive line starters, young linebackers like Troy Anderson, Michael Walker, Isaiah Oliver, Richie Grant, Jalen Hawkins. There's dozen or so guys that are basically toss-ups at this point at best. And I think if you're on the more optimistic side of things, you're maybe thinking like 8 or 9 of those guys could wind up working out. For me, I feel like getting 5 or 6 of those guys, roughly half of those guys working out would be an outstanding outcome for the Falcons. And like, if you're going to twist my arm and to try to get me to be the most optimistic I am possibly capable, humanly possible of being on this podcast, which is, I'm already feeling pain just trying to be optimistic on today's episode. It's hurting me in my side. I'm getting a stitch. But like, I look at that group of a dozen guys and I say like maybe 5 of those guys I'd be willing to bet money on, turning out to be, these sort of key contributors on a playoff caliber team. Those are guys like Brian Edwards, maybe Matt Hennessy, maybe Troy Anderson, Richie Grant, and potentially a healthy Isaiah Oliver if he can pick up where he left off last year in this DMP scheme. But even then, like, I don't feel great about making those 5 bets. Like I might be willing to not lose too much sleep if I was to make 3 of those bets. Like maybe Isaiah Oliver, Richie Grant would be 2 out of those 3, and then it's kind of a toss up between Troy Anderson and Brian Edwards. And it's not because I don't think Brian Edwards is a good player, but it goes back to a thing I said earlier where it's like my bet on Brian Edwards is kind of betting on Arthur Smith. And right now I'm not quite ready to make that bet. And again, I know to a lot of you, it sounds like I'm basically saying Arthur Smith is a terrible coach and I hate him, and I don't. But to me, his play calling was very vanilla last year. And so it feels like to me, I'm betting on Dirk Cutter. I'm betting on, Steve Sarkisian, and longtime listeners know that's not bets that I in particular are very feeling great about making when I think the play caller is on that level, which is like mid-level. Like to me, I always kind of described Cutter as being like the Andy Dalton of offensive coordinators. It's just like, yeah, he's fine, but like, that's not moving the needle for your football team. And that's kind of where I'm at with Arthur Smith. And I am expecting him to be better. Frankly, he has to be better this upcoming season. And it goes back to a conversation we had later last year where, my perception, I think if you're trying to sell me, when I try to sell myself on Arthur Smith, I'm basically made the argument last year that, he was a new chef opening up a restaurant and he wanted to master the fundamentals, and he had a limited tasting menu, 5 items on that menu, 2 appetizers, 2 entrees, and a dessert. He's like, we're going to master these things, and that's all we're going to offer to our patrons until we get it right. And then we can expand the menu. And I do think he did expand, the menu somewhat towards the end of the season with, an occasional lunch special or something like that. Or it's like, hey, we got some fresh strawberries and we'll make some, I don't know, some dessert out of strawberries or whatever the case may be. And so he did that on occasion towards the end of the season. So that's one indication, but like, I feel like that menu has to expand this year, because like you can have that limited menu when you have Derrick Henry and AJ Brown as part of that menu, or Julio Jones, as it were, when we had guys like Sark and Cutter calling plays, and you didn't have to be great because you could always just throw it to, these Hall of Fame caliber players. And I know maybe that's a little premature for guys like Derrick Henry and AJ Brown, but certainly premier players in the league. But when I look at this roster, like to me, that's, particularly on offense, no offense to AJ Terrell, but like, and no offense to Chris Lindstrom, but individual offensive linemen aren't like necessarily moving the needle like that for your team. But I look at kind of Kyle Pitts as that one guy that's on that tier. And so like, I don't know if that's going to cut it with this, 5-item menu. So I'm hoping, that menu's 10 items. It doesn't have to be Cheesecake Factory, right? It doesn't have to be 40 pages long, but we got to expand that menu this upcoming season, Arthur Smith. And if he can do that, I will feel definitely a lot more confident about this team in their direction moving forward. And certainly, if you're upset with the quote unquote negativity on the podcast, we will certainly praise them, right? Like, that's the thing about Locked On Falcons. It's not for everybody. I'm not going to sit here and mince words for you and sit here and tell you like, it's all gumdrops and rainbow. It's all going to work out. Like, I'm going to sit here and tell you what I see. Right. And if the film shows me that the team is playing well, I'll tell you that. If the film shows me the team is not playing well and that they need a lot of areas to improve, I will tell you that. We're not going to mince words. And I know a lot of you guys appreciate that about Locked On Falcons, but I'm sure plenty of you don't. And you're upset, because it's June. Like, this is positivity and gumdrops and rainbows and all these various things. And why aren't you being that guy? And I'm like, that's not me. But that's where we'll leave today's conversation, guys. And that will do it for us on today's episode of Locked On Falcons. I apologize for those of you that woke up Thursday and Friday morning without your, fix of Locked On Falcons, but been dealing with some, stress and burnout, trying to get my mental health right. And, it's tough doing, 50 plus weeks of 5 episodes talking about the Falcons and given some of the stuff that's been going on in America these last couple of weeks, just kind of contributing to my stress and whatnot. And so I just needed a little bit of a mini break. Grinding D'Angelo Malone film just felt, like going through the motions last week. And so we'll get to a D'Angelo Malone scatter report later this week. We'll probably be joined potentially by Matt Waldman later this week, possibly tomorrow. I'll just have to double check with confirm the schedule, and he'll come on and talk a little bit more about Desmond Ridder and his thoughts on Drake London and Tyler Algier, as well as maybe pick Matt's brain on sort of that, quarterback hit rate, which I know he's written about and certainly could share some insights into that stuff as we move forward. So that's what's on deck. In the future, I won't promise that we'll be back to a 5-show-a-week schedule. Certainly, you can expect Monday, Wednesday, Friday content. Probably this week, we'll probably at least get another day in here on Tuesday or Thursday or whatever the case may be. So I'll try to give you guys a heads up if we wind up skipping a day or something like that. But, there's a little less to talk about over these next couple of weeks. And hopefully, I'm not feeling the stress or whatever the case may be. So I can give you that 5-day-a-week content. But that's the goal. That's the hope. Someone or a Locked On show that's not going to be skimping on 5 days a week content for you guys is the Locked On NFL podcast. Is going to got you covered for all 32 NFL teams, not just the Atlanta Falcons. So go check out Locked On NFL on your preferred podcast platform: Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course on YouTube, guys. And if you want to provide your feedback on anything I discussed on today's episode, we'll have some opportunities to do some mailbags to potentially fill in some of this time. Those are less stressful for me. You can do so by hitting me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And of course, you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. So guys, I appreciate it. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope, 2 days of not having Locked On Falcons content didn't stress you out too much. And I hope you guys enjoy, the rest of this week and the rest of your summer as we get back on track here on Locked On Falcons. But appreciate it. Till then.